Okay, let's get right into it. It is the morning of Sunday, March 8, 2026. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a critical time.
It really is. Over the last week, the world as we know it has fundamentally shifted. We are looking at a massive, rapidly evolving crisis that erupted in the Middle East just over a week ago, right at the tail end of February.
Yeah, and it's moving incredibly fast.
Right. So the mission of today's deep dive is to cut through the absolute fog of war. We have gathered a mountain of sources, predominantly hours upon hours of YouTube videos, detailed interviews with geopolitical analysts, and deep dive military strategy breakdowns uploaded over just the last couple of days.
All raw, immediate analysis from people watching this unfold in real time.
Exactly. We are going to extract exactly what is happening on the ground and, more importantly, how it is going to impact you, the average Western citizen, in the coming weeks. We are bypassing the spin and getting straight into the facts, the analysis, and the raw strategic realities.
Which is absolutely necessary right now.
But before we get into the weeds, I need to make one thing absolutely clear to you, the listener. The sources we're pulling from contain highly charged political and geopolitical content. We are not taking any sides here.
None at all.
Right. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the original materials or the analysts we reviewed. We are simply acting as a filter, imparting the facts, the analyses, and the ideas exactly as they were presented in the sources so you can understand what's actually going on.
What's fascinating here is the absolute whiplash of the strategic reality we are witnessing. If we look at the initial 30,000-foot view provided by these defense analysts, what began as Operation Epic Fury, which was this joint United States and Israeli preemptive strike aimed at rapidly toppling the Iranian regime, has instantly spiraled into a systemic war of attrition.
A total shift.
Right. We are looking at a definitive real-time rupture in the post-World War II global security architecture. The unipolar moment, that long era of uncontested Western military dominance, it isn't just fracturing, it is actively being dismantled.
And that brings us to why you need to listen today. Why should you care about a localized conflict or, say, a radar system sitting in a desert halfway across the world? Because, as we're going to outline, the ripple effects of that specific radar system going offline directly impact the global supply chain, the price of the food on your table, the gas in your car, and the fundamental structure of the global economy that you rely on.
It hits home immediately.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the opening moves of this conflict. On February 28, the U.S. and Israel launched a massive preemptive strike. And according to the military breakdowns we've been watching, the technological scale of this was unprecedented.
Unprecedented is the right word.
We are talking about the integration of cutting-edge Anthropic AI targeting systems, orchestrating fleets of B-2 stealth bombers, B-1 Lancers, and F-35 fighter jets. The explicit goal was a swift, total decapitation of the state.
The initial reports of the successes, well, at least from the perspective of the U.S. and Israeli planners, were genuinely staggering in their precision. The U.S. President Donald Trump went on the record shortly after the strikes, claiming that 48 top-tier Iranian leaders were taken out in a single coordinated blow.
48 leaders in one night.
Exactly. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed, and subsequent intelligence confirmed his wife also died from injuries sustained in those strikes. On the Israeli side, their specialized bunker-busting munitions managed to completely destroy the internal security headquarters in Tehran.
They didn't stop there either.
No, they didn't. They leveled the Expediency Council building, which, for context, is the critical advisory body that resolves legislative conflicts and essentially acts as the administrative glue of the regime. They also heavily struck the deeply buried nuclear sites at Natanz.
And there was a cyber component too, right?
Yeah, they even integrated a psychological warfare element. They hacked popular Iranian prayer apps to send mass push notifications, urging the public to defect and resist the government. It was an overwhelming, synchronized display of kinetic and cyber power.
It sounds like something straight out of a military thriller. You take out the supreme leadership, you destroy the command and control centers, you hit the nuclear infrastructure, and you directly message the populace. The explicit expectation from Washington and Tel Aviv was that the Iranian public, who we have seen actively protesting their government for years, would immediately rise up and overthrow whatever was left of the theological structure.
That was the foundational assumption of the whole operation.
Right. The U.S. president even released a statement telling the Iranian military and police to lay down their arms, take back their country, and offer them total immunity. But wait, If they had all this intelligence and they knew about Iran's extensive underground base networks, why did military planners genuinely believe a 4-day decapitation strike would actually work?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question dominating the strategic interviews we've been analyzing. It basically comes down to a massive systemic over-reliance on cyber warfare, compounded by profound intelligence echo chambers.
Echo chambers in the Pentagon.
Yes. The military planners relied heavily on a concept they called a 10-hour cyber neutralization period. The operational theory was that U.S. Cyber Command could completely paralyze the Iranian regime's communications, power grids, and military command structures electronically.
Plunge them into the dark.
Exactly. They believed they could plunge the state into a 10-hour blackout, giving the physical bombers completely uncontested access to the skies and preventing any coordinated launch of retaliatory missiles. But they catastrophically overestimated their electronic warfare capabilities against a decentralized system.
Because Iran isn't wired like we are.
Right. They assumed Iran's networks functioned like Western, highly centralized grids. Instead, Iran had spent decades building localized, hardened intranets and burying miles of fiber optic cables that were completely isolated from the global internet.
So it's like trying to unplug a massive, sprawling server farm by pulling one main wire, only to realize the system has thousands of decentralized underground backup generators that kick on instantly. The lights didn't stay off.
That's a great way to put it. The communications never fully dropped. And beyond the cyber failure, there was a fatal misread of the domestic psychology. Our sources point out that intelligence agencies were relying on deeply flawed data regarding the Iranian public's willingness to overthrow the government while under a foreign invasion.
The rally around the flag effect.
Precisely. Analysts noted that the CIA was reportedly pointing to internet polls suggesting 80% of Iranians wanted the regime overthrown. But more traditional, rigorous academic polling, the kind that accounts for national pride during a crisis, suggested the regime actually retained around 70% foundational support when faced with external destruction.
That is a staggering miscalculation. And you can see this brutal reality setting in when you look at how the official timelines have shifted over the last, in the early hours of February 28, this was pitched as a 4-day surgical operation.
Yeah. 4 days.
Then, as the retaliation started, the rhetoric quietly shifted to 4 weeks. Now, as of this weekend, the defense analysts are reporting that the Pentagon is scrambling to prepare logistics for a 100-day war, with whispers in the intelligence community that this could drag on until September or even become a multi-year quagmire.
Which means the paradigm has violently shifted from a surgical strike to an uncontained war of attrition. And if we look at how Iran is actually fighting back against a massively superior air force, it points to a fascinating and terrifying shift toward asymmetric warfare.
Right, because they can't match the U.S. plane for plane.
Not even close. Iran's retaliation strategy is effectively death by 1,000 cuts. Despite suffering catastrophic losses to their leadership and surface infrastructure, the military apparatus hasn't folded. They retreated into vast, deeply fortified underground bases carved into the Zagros Mountains.
The geography there is intense.
It is. These are 3,000-meter-high, jagged peaks where U.S. ground forces simply cannot easily operate, and where the rock is so dense that even the heaviest Western bunker-busting munitions struggle to penetrate the subterranean missile silos.
And what's coming out of those silos is redefining the battlefield. Let's talk about the Khorramshahr cluster missiles, because when I was watching the breakdowns of this specific weapon system, my jaw hit the floor. This isn't just a standard rocket. Can you break down the physics of what this missile actually does?
Gladly, because understanding the mechanics here is crucial to understanding why Western defense grids are failing. The Khorramshahr is a medium-range ballistic missile, but Iran has modified its payload delivery. They fire these missiles high into the atmosphere on a parabolic arc.
Okay, so up into space, essentially.
Right. But instead of one massive single warhead coming down to strike a target, the missile's payload bus opens up upon re-entry traveling at Mach speeds and releases 80 individual submunitions. Each of these bomblets weighs 20 kilograms and contains 3 kilograms of high explosives.
So it's literally like firing a shotgun blast from space.
That is the perfect analogy. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of how modern air defense works, you instantly understand the panic in the Pentagon. Highly advanced, incredibly expensive defense systems like Israel's Iron Dome or the U.S.-backed David Sling are algorithmic marvels.
You track individual targets, right?
Exactly. They are designed to calculate the precise trajectory of a single incoming rocket or a single ballistic missile and then fire a highly sophisticated interceptor to collide with it in midair. But when a Khorramshahr missile releases 80 submunitions at high altitude, they spread out in a massive cone.
It just overwhelms the radar.
Complete saturation. The targeting radars are suddenly looking at 80 distinct hypervelocity targets. You cannot assign an individual multi-million-dollar interceptor missile to 80 different 20-kilogram chunks of metal raining down on a military base. The math breaks down entirely. The system saturates, the radar clutters, and the interceptor stockpiles are exhausted in minutes.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because it's not just the high-end ballistic missiles overwhelming the defenses, it's the absolute bottom-tier technology as well. The economics of the Shahed drone swarms are keeping military logisticians awake at night. The analysts broke down the cost disparity, and it is almost comical if it weren't so deadly.
It's a terrifying cost ratio.
It really is. Iran is building these Shahed suicide drones using commercial, off-the-shelf parts. We are talking about basic GPS modules and moped engines sourced from internet retailers for roughly $1,500 to $3,500 a pop. Because they are so simple, they don't need massive, vulnerable aerospace factories to build them. They're being churned out in decentralized locations, even retrofitted apartment buildings and auto garages, producing hundreds a month with zero supply chain friction.
And here is the fatal catch for the West. The United States and its allies are forced to fire highly sophisticated interceptor missiles, like the PAC-3 missiles used in the Patriot batteries, to shoot down these incredibly cheap drones. Each of those interceptors costs anywhere from $2 to $4 million.
$2 to $4 million to shoot down a moped engine with wings.
Exactly. Furthermore, the industrial capacity of the West has atrophied. The defense contractors are reportedly only capable of producing a very small number of these specific high-end interceptors per month. The economic asymmetry is staggering. The West is firing Lamborghinis at lawnmowers. And because they are doing this continuously, they are simply running out of defensive ammunition.
Which plays exactly into the strategy. They aren't just firing these drones blindly into the desert hoping to hit a tent. They are deliberately blinding the United States. The strategy videos highlight how Iran has successfully targeted the ANTPY-2 radar systems.
Those are critical assets.
Yeah, for context, these aren't just satellite dishes. These are $1.1 billion state-of-the-art radar installations located in Jordan and Qatar that can see a baseball from thousands of miles away. They are the absolute linchpin of the region's early warning network. Iran has also aggressively targeted TCAT sites, the Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense Systems.
The last line of defense.
Exactly. These are the absolute last line of defense against high-altitude ballistic missiles, and losing them leaves entire regions completely exposed. They are using a $2,000 drone to destroy the billion-dollar eyes that guide the million-dollar interceptors.
It is a masterclass in asymmetrical attritional warfare. Once you blind the defense systems by taking out the ANTPY-2 and the Shahed radars, the larger, infinitely more destructive Khorramshahr ballistic missiles can slip through undefended to wipe out the actual air bases and troop concentrations. Now, the military analysts do point out a glaring frustration here. There is a highly cost-effective, proven defense against these low and slow drones.
Right, the CRAM system. I'm deep in the weeds on this. It stands for Counter-Rocket Artillery and Mortar. If you've ever seen footage of it, it looks like a giant white dome with a massive Gatling gun attached to it, like R2-D2 with a minigun.
That's a very accurate description.
It's basically an automated cannon that uses a localized radar to track incoming drones or mortars, and it fires 4,500 rounds a minute. It creates this literal wall of lead and explosive tracer rounds in the sky that just shreds the drones into confetti. It's relatively cheap to operate, it's highly effective, and it has protected forward operating bases for years. But the breakdowns highlight a massive, inexplicable logistical failure. The U.S. simply failed to deploy enough of these CRAM systems to their various bases and radar sites across the Gulf before initiating Operation Epic Fury.
Which leaves billions of dollars of critical, irreplaceable infrastructure exposed to a hobbyist-level drone. And this failure to contain the threat locally to protect the immediate airspace leads directly into the geopolitical chain reaction we are witnessing. What was sold as a strictly contained surgical strike on Iranian leadership has violently spilled over all recognized borders.
The containment totally failed.
It did. Israel, having initiated the strikes alongside the U.S., is now facing relentless, saturated rocket fire from Hezbollah in the north and has subsequently launched ground operations into Lebanon to try and neutralize the launch sites. The conflict is spreading like wildfire through the Levant.
And the list of secondary targets is genuinely shocking. Remember, the core assumption of this operation was that the U.S. would maintain uncontested air supremacy. But Iran is successfully striking U.S. bases and allied assets in the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, and crucially in Qatar, specifically targeting the massive Al Udeid air base.
That's a massive escalation.
It is. This isn't just an airstrip. Al Udeid is the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command. It is the logistical heart of the entire Middle Eastern military apparatus. They even managed to strike a British RAF base all the way in Cyprus with a long-range drone. And because the skies over the Middle East are now completely congested with incoming drones, outgoing interceptors, civilian commercial flights trying to escape, and panicked air defense operators staring at cluttered screens, we are seeing the inevitable tragedy of friendly fire.
The Kuwait incident.
Yes. In one devastating event highlighted in the reports, Kuwaiti air defenses accidentally locked onto and shot down 3 U.S. F-15E Strike Eagle fighter jets. The crews miraculously survived and ejected, but the loss of 3 multi-million-dollar aircraft to an allied nation's air defense perfectly encapsulates the absolute chaos in the skies over the Gulf.
Amidst all this operational chaos, there is a fascinating political contradiction developing inside Iran that the geopolitical strategists have been dissecting. The newly prominent Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, actually issued a formal public apology to the neighboring Gulf states.
Really, an apology right in the middle of all this.
Yes. He claimed that the Interim Leadership Council had reached a consensus that they would not attack their neighbors unless a direct strike on Iran originated from those specific countries' territories. He was attempting to de-escalate with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Yet, immediately after he broadcast that statement, the Iranian military, specifically the aerospace forces of the Revolutionary Guard, completely ignored the civilian apology and continued launching heavy strikes on Gulf states hosting U.S. assets.
So the military just rogue vetoed the president.
Exactly. This exposes a deep, severe rift within Iran's survival structure. You have the political figures desperately trying to manage diplomatic fallout and prevent a broader coalition from forming against them, while the hardline military apparatus is executing an uncompromising total war survival strategy.
And it is not just the southern Gulf borders that are erupting. If we look north to the Caucasus, the map is equally unstable. Azerbaijan has reportedly mobilized heavy troop concentrations along its border with Iran. And in response, or perhaps as a preemptive warning, Iranian drones have already struck an airport in the Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhchivan,
Opening up a northern front.
Right. On top of that, there are swirling rumors which are reportedly being corroborated by locals on the ground, according to some of the analytical interviews that U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies are actively arming and funding Kurdish separatist factions in northern Iran and Iraq. The strategy appears to be an attempt to spark a full-blown, multi-front civil war inside Iran to further stretch their military resources.
But attempting to orchestrate a civil war abroad while facing intense domestic pushback at home is a perilous strategy. This brings us to the reaction within the United States. The blowback from both the civilian public and elements of the military is significant and growing. Polling from major news outlets, analyzed in these videos, indicates that only 27% of the U.S. public actually supports this military engagement.
Only 27%. That's incredibly low for the start of a conflict.
It is an incredibly unpopular conflict, largely because it erupted seemingly out of nowhere for the average citizen and instantly threatened their economic stability. Furthermore, there are alarming cultural indicators coming from within the armed forces. Watchdog groups have reported receiving hundreds of complaints just in the last week about U.S. military officers utilizing what they describe as apocalyptic Christian rhetoric to justify the war to their troops.
Wait, apocalyptic?
Yes. They are framing this conflict not as a geopolitical necessity, but as a holy war, or the literal beginning of Armageddon.
That is wild. But why is that happening? Why resort to that kind of extreme rhetoric in a modern professional military?
The analysts suggest it is a symptom of a profound recruitment and morale crisis. When a war lacks clear strategic objectives, or when the initial promise of a 4-day operation evaporates into a grinding, bloody stalemate, leadership often grasps for ideological or religious absolutism to maintain discipline and motivation. When the geopolitical logic fails to inspire troops who are watching their multi-billion-dollar bases get hit by cheap drones, framing the conflict as a divine man-knot becomes a desperate tool for unit cohesion.
Wow. And that desperation is spilling out into the public square. You even have military veterans taking direct physical action against the government. The sources detailed a recent, highly publicized incident where a U.S. Marine veteran named Brian McGinnis infiltrated a U.S. Senate hearing.
I saw the footage of that.
Yeah, he completely derailed the proceedings, protesting the war, and loudly shouting that the working class does not want to bleed for foreign entanglements before being physically dragged out by Capitol Police and a sitting senator. The manufactured narrative that this is a clean, universally supported, necessary operation is completely collapsing under the weight of these realities.
Which brings us to the most critical, immediate impact of this deep dive. Because while the military strategy, the drone math, and the geopolitical maneuvering are highly complex, the ultimate impact of this failure lands directly and forcefully on the global macroeconomic system.
Exactly. So what does this all mean for you? If you are tracking your investments, managing a household budget, or running a small business, why does a barrage of cluster missiles in the Zagros Mountains matter to your daily life? The simple, unavoidable answer is that the global economy is choking to death right now.
The arteries are blocked.
All right, the Strait of Hormuz, the incredibly narrow, vital global artery connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, where upwards of 20 to 30% of the world's oil flows, is essentially blocked to Western shipping. Iran hasn't officially, legally closed it, but they are actively harassing, boarding, and attacking Western and allied commercial vessels. The marine insurance premiums have skyrocketed to the point where it's financially ruinous to sail a tanker through that choke point, making it completely impassable for our supply chains.
The macroeconomic fallout in the energy markets is immediate, brutal, and compounding. Brent crude oil prices have already surged to nearly $100 a barrel, and geopolitical energy analysts are raising the alarm that if the strait remains uninsurable, it could easily hit $200 a barrel in the near future.
$200.
Yes. Think about the cascading effect of that. It isn't just the price of gasoline at the pump jumping to $6 or $7 a gallon. It is the cost of transporting every single physical good you consume. It fundamentally alters the cost structure of global logistics. Furthermore, Qatar, which is a massive, indispensable supplier of global energy, has been forced to halt its liquid natural gas or LNG production due to the regional instability.
And Europe relies heavily on that.
Exactly. In Europe, which was already precariously balancing its energy needs, the situation is so dire that the EU is facing imminent, official, state-mandated energy rationing for industrial and residential sectors.
And it's not just about gas and electricity. This is what the analysts are terrifyingly calling the everything shortage. Let's look at a critical vulnerability most people never think about: fertilizers. A massive percentage of the world's fertilizer originates in immense petrochemical complexes located along the Gulf coastlines. The Haber-Bosch process, which creates the ammonia necessary for fertilizer, requires massive amounts of natural gas.
And that gas is now offline.
Right. Because of the missile strikes, the threat to the shipping lanes, and the diversion of natural gas, those Gulf factories are going offline. And here's the truly terrifying part. They are going offline right at the exact moment the Northern Hemisphere planting season begins. If farmers in North America and Europe cannot get fertilizer, or if the cost of it quadruples, crop yields will plummet. We aren't just talking about a slightly more expensive grocery run. The analysts are warning about massive spikes in agricultural commodities trading, severe food inflation, and the very real possibility of localized famine in emerging markets that rely on cheap grain imports.
The crisis has also thrown the global aviation industry into total chaos. The skies over the Middle East are effectively a no-fly zone for commercial traffic. Gulf airspace is closed. Major international flights bridging Europe to Asia are having to drastically reroute around the entire region, adding hours to flight times, scrambling crew schedules, and burning massive amounts of expensive, heavily taxed aviation fuel.
The logistics are a nightmare.
Completely. Dubai International Airport, which operates as one of the busiest transit hubs on the planet, had to completely suspend operations because drone and missile interceptions were literally happening in the airspace right over the passenger runways.
Predictably, global stock markets are reacting exactly as you would expect to a sudden halt in global trade. They are plummeting. The panic selling is wiping out trillions in wealth across the board. The sources noted a specific example to show the contagion. The Pakistan Stock Exchange experienced a devastating 9.5% drop in a single day. The economic panic isn't localized. It is spreading instantly through algorithmic trading and interconnected financial systems.
But nestled within this broader economic panic is a highly specific, hidden vulnerability that is perhaps the most alarming indicator for the Western military-industrial complex. We have to talk about the critical minerals crisis, and specifically the sudden weaponization of silver.
Silver, like the precious metal.
Yes. Silver is highly conductive, incredibly reliable, and resistant to corrosion. Because of those properties, it is a required, non-replaceable component in the guidance systems of almost every single precision-guided munition the United States fires. Every smart bomb, every Patriot interceptor, every cruise missile requires a baseline amount of industrial silver to function.
And here's where the geopolitics tied directly and painfully into the supply chain. China and Mexico are the two largest producers and exporters of silver in the world. And according to the market analysis in our sources, they are aggressively hoarding the silver market.
Squeezing the supply.
Exactly. China has restricted exports of critical minerals and has even sanctioned specific parts of the U.S. defense industry. Mexico has been quietly keeping its silver production at home, building domestic reserves. Because the West is burning through its stockpile of precision munitions at a totally unsustainable rate to shoot down cheap drones, the U.S. defense industry is facing a severe, acute supply chain crisis. They literally cannot procure the silver they need to build the guidance systems for the bombs required to fight the war.
Which is a profound strategic failure.
It has gotten so existentially bad that the Pentagon had to urgently, forcefully invest $3 billion into constructing a brand new domestic smelter just to try and secure a local sovereign supply of these critical minerals. But you can't just build a highly complex smelter overnight. The environmental permitting, the logistics, the workforce training, it takes years.
This specific silver crisis perfectly illustrates the fragile interconnectedness of the modern world order. A localized war in the Middle East instantly drains the U.S. stockpile of defensive missiles, which immediately exposes a fatal supply chain dependency on China and Mexico for raw materials, which in turn forces emergency, inflationary domestic spending by the Pentagon, all while broader consumer inflation skyrockets due to constrained energy and shipping costs.
It's a domino effect.
Which leads us seamlessly to our final area of analysis. Because while the West, Israel, and Iran are bleeding vast amounts of resources, infrastructure, and human lives, other global superpowers are watching closely from the sidelines, maneuvering, and absolutely winning.
The shadow players. Let's look at Russia's role in this expanding theater. The intelligence reports and strategic analysts indicate that Russia is not just sitting back and eating popcorn. They are actively, quietly participating. They are reportedly providing direct, high-level satellite intelligence and targeting data to the Iranian military, explicitly helping them map and precisely hit U.S. forces and radar installations.
A massive geopolitical advantage for them.
And it gets more ironic. Because Gulf oil is suddenly cut off from the global market and Western shipping is paralyzed, Russia's own oil exports are suddenly in much higher demand globally. The irony here is thick and staggering. The U.S. actually had to grant waivers and allow India to purchase more Russian oil just to offset the massive global shortage caused by the Middle East crisis. So this war has essentially rescued and enriched the heavily sanctioned Russian energy economy while actively punishing Western consumers.
Then there is the role of China, which is arguably conducting an absolute masterclass in grand geopolitical maneuvering. China is successfully securing its own vast energy needs while simultaneously appearing to the global south as the only reasonable adult in the room.
I read this specific detail in one of the maritime breakdowns, and it blew my mind. Remember how we discussed that the Strait of Hormuz is functionally blocked to Western shipping due to insurance costs and Iranian attacks? Well, a massive Chinese commercial cargo ship safely navigated the perilous strait simply by changing its automatic identification system, its AIS signal, which broadcasts the ship's data to everyone in the area to read a simple phrase: China owner.
China owner, that's incredible.
The Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval patrols saw that digital signal, verified it, and let the ship pass completely unharmed while actively boarding and attacking Western vessels in the same waters. The psychological blow to the U.S. Navy watching a Chinese ship sail unbothered through a blockade that is crippling the West is immense. Furthermore, China is actively playing the regional peacemaker. They are sending a high-level special envoy to mediate between the Gulf states and Iran, explicitly offering to help protect the civilian infrastructure of the UAE and Saudi Arabia from Iranian strikes.
They're filling the void.
By stepping into this diplomatic void, they make the United States and Israel look like the sole chaotic aggressors destabilizing the region, while China presents itself as the mature guarantor of global trade and stability.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important macroeconomic question of our time. If we look at the quiet strategic alignment of Iran, Russia, and China in this moment, we see the rapid acceleration of much larger systemic threat to the United States, the intentional death of the petrodollar system.
The foundation of U.S. economic power.
Exactly. For decades, the global oil trade has been fundamentally priced and settled in U.S. dollars. This dynamic gives the U.S. economy massive structural advantages.
Yeah.
It creates artificial global demand for the dollar, allows the U.S. to run massive deficits without immediate consequence, and allows Washington to effectively weaponize sanctions by locking countries out of the dollar-based financial system. But with the U.S. deeply entangled in this unwinnable war and actively weaponizing its financial system against its adversaries, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and crucially, major energy producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who have recently joined or aligned with the bloc, are aggressively accelerating their long-term plans to bypass the dollar entirely.
The financial analysts in our sources outline active, credible speculation that these BRICS nations are using this crisis to engineer and launch a new alternative currency system. And unlike fiat currencies, they are looking at a system backed by actual hard commodities like gold, silver, and rare earth metals.
A return to a commodity standard.
Right. If they successfully enforce a parallel system, where their immense reserves of oil, manufactured goods, and critical minerals can only be purchased using this new currency or directly traded in local currencies outside the SWIFT banking system, it completely bypasses Western sanctions. More terrifyingly for the average citizen listening to this, the macroeconomic analysts estimate that the end of the petrodollar monopoly could trigger massive overnight inflation in the United States. Trillions of dollars currently held by foreign central banks would suddenly lose their utility and come flooding back into the U.S. economy, chasing the same amount of goods. It would effectively cripple the purchasing power of the U.S. consumer without a single shot ever being fired at the American homeland.
It is a devastating multi-generational strategic trap. The United States exhausts its cutting-edge military hardware, heavily depletes its national treasury, and alienates its traditional allies in a prolonged, grinding Middle Eastern conflict, all while its primary geopolitical rivals, China and Russia, consolidate real economic power, secure vital supply chains, and systematically rewrite the rules of global trade.
So let's bring this all together and look at the big picture. What is the ultimate summary of this deep dive? It is March 2026, and what was aggressively sold to the global public as a precise, surgical, 4-day decapitation strike has devolved into a massive global fracture. The United States has visibly, undeniably lost its uncontested military supremacy in the face of cheap, asymmetric drone warfare and saturated missile strikes. The global supply chain is violently buckling under the strain of a closed Strait of Hormuz. And the economic ripple effects from $100 oil to skyrocketing food prices driven by fertilizer shortages are already reaching your wallet and will only compound from here.
For you, the listener, the daily tactical movements and the fog of war will continue to obscure the reality on the ground, but there are ultimate macro-level indicators you must watch for in the coming weeks. First, watch closely for official energy rationing in Europe. If the EU actually mandates rolling blackouts or cuts to industrial gas and electricity, it marks a severe point of no return for the Western industrial economy.
And the second indicator.
Second, watch for any whispers or legislative movements regarding a military draft conscription or massive stop-loss readiness mobilizations in the U.S. that will signal a desperate, disastrous pivot toward a ground war that military planners fundamentally know they cannot win easily. And third, watch the news for any false flag incidents or sudden escalations at major religious sites in the Middle East, such as the Al-Aqsa compound. An event there could instantly escalate this from a complex geopolitical conflict into an uncontrollable civilizational holy war.
As we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to really mull over. When we look at the broad history of the world, history shows us that great empires rarely fall from a single massive military defeat on a grand battlefield. Instead, they slowly bleed out. They collapse under the crushing weight of unwinnable conflicts far from home that quietly drain their wealth, their industrial capacity, and their political will. As the West continues to pour its treasure, its billion-dollar radars and its multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles into the impregnable mountains of Iran to swat down cheap drones, are we actually watching the intentional, engineered exhaustion of the American empire by rival superpowers who haven't even had to fire a single shot themselves? Keep your eyes open, watch those indicators in the markets and the news, and stay curious. Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive.
It is Sunday, March 8th, 2026. A little over a week ago, a conflict kicked off in the Middle East that has, and this is no exaggeration, already sent shockwaves across the entire planet. What we were told was a limited, surgical strike has just spiraled into a massive regional war, and the consequences are hitting everybody. So let's break down exactly how this happened and what it really means for all of us.
This is the big one, isn't it? The question on everyone's mind.
How did we get here so unbelievably fast? We went from hearing about a supposedly quick operation to, just days later, major airports shutting down, oil prices going through the roof, and, well, the entire world basically holding its breath. We're going to unpack the timeline, the huge miscalculations, and the ripples that are now washing up on all our shores. To really get a sense of the scale here, let's just start with one number, 60%. That's how much of the entire U.S. inventory of Tomahawk cruise missiles, we're talking their go-to long-range precision weapons, were reportedly fired in just the first 72 hours. Let that sink in. This was never a small-scale operation. It was one of the most intense long-range attacks in modern history. And that was just the beginning. So to understand how this fire got so big, so fast, you have to go right to the epicenter. You have to look at the initial military gamble that went so catastrophically wrong.
The plan, a joint U.S.-Israeli operation codenamed Operation Epic Fury, was built on this very idea. It's called a decapitation strike. The theory was, you take out Iran's supreme leader and all their top commanders in one fell swoop, and the whole regime just collapses from the inside. A quick, clean victory. That was the hope.
But that theory ran headfirst into a very brutal reality. The whole plan depended on a massive cyber attack that was supposed to paralyze Iran's command and control systems. But it didn't work. What the planners apparently completely underestimated was that Iran has spent the last 20 years preparing for this exact day. Their command structures weren't fragile, they were hardened, they were spread out, and they were resilient. The knockout blow never landed. And because that first punch missed, the conflict didn't just end. No, instead, the first ripple started to spread, and pretty soon, the entire Middle East was on fire. You know, the most shocking thing here is just the raw speed of it all. Within 24 hours of that first strike, Iran's retaliation was already underway. By day 3, Hezbollah had opened up a whole new front against Israel from Lebanon. By day 5, a ballistic missile slams right into Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That's the biggest American base in the whole region. And then get this, even as Iran's new president was publicly apologizing, the attacks on neighboring countries just kept on coming. So this very quickly stopped being just a war in Iran. The retaliation wasn't just hitting back at Israel or some far-off U.S. bases. It was directly targeting the Gulf nations that host American forces. We're talking about major economic hubs like Dubai's airport being forced to shut down, critical oil refineries in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain being hit, and Qatar, a vital global energy supplier, having to halt all of its liquefied natural gas production. This is a full-blown, multi-front regional war, period. And the diplomatic damage has been just as severe. To defend Israel, the U.S. had to pull its most advanced air defense systems, the Patriot and THAAD missile interceptors, from its partners in the Gulf. This quote from a report just a few days ago really sums it up. That single decision has shattered the trust of allies who now feel like they've been completely left out to dry. This ripple didn't just stop at the water's edge. Oh no, it has now become a full-blown global economic shockwave. And this is the part where the conflict really starts to hit home for everyone, no matter where you live. To understand this economic crisis, you have to understand one specific place on the map, the Strait of Hormuz. It is, without a doubt, the world's most critical choke point for energy. Think about this. A staggering 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply passes through that one narrow waterway, every single day. And right now, it is completely paralyzed. Iran has effectively shut it down. The main artery that fuels a fifth of the global economy has been clamped shut. And the effect was, as you'd expect, immediate. Before all this started, a barrel of Brent crude oil was trading for about $80. As of yesterday, it hit $110. And analysts are now saying it's probably going to blow right past $150 a barrel very, very soon. That means serious pain at the pump for all of us, and it acts like a massive tax on the entire global economy. And crucially, this isn't just about oil. With Qatar being forced to halt all of its liquefied natural gas exports, Europe is in extreme danger. Their energy grid was already under huge strain because of the war in Ukraine. Now it's facing the very real possibility of collapse. We are talking about a potential continent-wide energy crisis. But you know, a crisis of this magnitude doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Other global powers, namely Russia and China, are not just sitting on the sidelines watching. They are active players on this chessboard, and they are using the chaos to their own advantage. For years leading up to this, both Russia and China were busy strengthening Iran. Russia was supplying military tech, and in return, getting Iranian drones for its war in Ukraine. China was providing advanced radar and missile defense systems. Well, now that war is here, they're cashing in. Russia is loving these sky-high oil prices, and they're more than happy to see America's military focus get pulled away from Europe. They're also reportedly feeding around satellite and targeting intelligence. China, on the other hand, is playing a shrewder game. They're reportedly negotiating safe passage for their own oil tankers, while publicly positioning themselves as the only ones who can mediate a peace deal, a direct challenge to America's role in the region.
So this all leads to the one key question. What is the real objective here? Officially, the line is that this is all about protecting Israel by taking out Iran's nuclear and missile programs, but a lot of analysts are pointing to other possible motives. Some are calling this a strategic energy war, a blunt attempt to control the Strait of Hormuz and starve a rival, China, of the energy it needs. Others see it through the lens of the war in Ukraine, a calculated move to cripple a key partner and weapons supplier for Russia.
So with all these pieces moving on the board, where do we possibly go from here? The situation is incredibly volatile, but there's some very clear signals you can watch for that'll tell you which way the wind is blowing.
We've basically distilled what the experts are saying down into 3 key things to keep an eye on. First, watch Jerusalem. Any major incident at the holy sites there, especially the Al-Aqsa Mosque, could ignite this from a regional conflict into a much wider religious war. Second, listen for one word in Washington: conscription. Any serious talk about a military draft would signal a huge escalation towards a ground war. And finally, watch Europe. The moment countries start to officially ration gas or electricity, that's the signal that the Western economy has truly hit a breaking point.
And make no mistake, the goal coming from the White House right now is not to calm things down. Just 2 days ago, the administration made its objective crystal clear. There will be no deals, no negotiations, no off-ramps. The goal is unconditional surrender.
And that leaves us with the final, terrifying question. The stated goal is total victory, but in a conflict that has already burned through military stockpiles, torched alliances, and crippled the global economy in just 1 week, you have to ask, what if that's not even possible? What if the only thing we're really fighting for is a world that's permanently broken?